The late summer heat baked the dusty ground of the auction yard, pressing down on the shoulders of the men who stood with their arms crossed, hats pulled low. It was a heat that promised no relief, only a deeper cracking of the earth and a shimmering haze on the horizon. The air was thick with the smells of manure, dry hay, and cheap tobacco, a familiar perfume of commerce and indifference. Murmurs moved through the crowd like a low wind, talk of cattle prices and the coming lack of rain. It was a place of hard calculations, where sentiment was a liability. That's when they were led into the ring. Not a fine quarter horse or a pen of stout yearlings. It was a mule, and a dying one at that. Her coat was the color of faded burlap, stretched tight over a rack of ribs that stood out like the timbers of a wrecked boat. Her head hung low, her long ears drooped, and a film of exhaustion coated her dark, liquid eyes. One hip was canted at a painful angle, causing her to drag the leg in a slow, scraping rhythm that sent up little puffs of dust with each agonizing step. Clinging to her side, with one small hand perpetually tangled in the coarse hairs of her mane, was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, a slip of a thing in clothes that were little more than patched rags. His face was smudged with dirt, and his eyes, wide and unervingly still, seemed to see everything and nothing at all. He did not speak. He did not look at the crowd. His entire existence seemed focused on the failing warmth of the animal beside him. The auctioneer, a man named Jebediah whose voice was as worn as the gavel he held, cleared his throat. He looked at the pair with a practiced weariness, an expression that navigated the space between pity and professional obligation. All right, folks, what we have here is a package lot. The mule, Daisy, and the boy. Comes with her. We're not splitting them up. A ripple of unease, followed by a few derisive chuckles, went through the crowd. A dying mule was a waste of a bullet. A stray boy was a matter for the sheriff. Tying them together was just bad business. "Do I have an opening bid?" Jebediah asked, his voice losing its usual rhythmic charm. "Let's say $20? For the halter." Silence. The sun beat down. The mule shifted her weight, a tremor running through her flank. The boy pressed closer. From the back of the crowd, a man in a clean, pressed shirt and polished boots spoke, his voice smooth and confident. Richard Sterling. He owned the biggest spread in the next county, a man known for buying up struggling ranches and consolidating power. "I'll give you 10. For the boy. You can keep the animal." His words were clipped, a clean transaction that separated value from waste. Jebediah shook his head. "They go together, Mr. Sterling. That's the arrangement." Sterling scoffed, a small, dismissive sound. "Then there's no deal." He was turning away when another voice cut through the heavy air. 50. The word was rough, cracked from disuse, like stones grinding together. Every head turned toward the source. It was Silas. He stood near the back fence, a man who seemed more a part of the weathered wood than separate from it. For 10 years, Silas had been a ghost in his own life, a fixture of the landscape who rarely spoke and never engaged. His face was a road map of some long-past grief, his eyes holding a permanent distance. The town remembered him as a master horseman once, before the tragedy that had hollowed him out and left him with nothing but a neglected ranch and a profound silence. Sterling turned back, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. He didn't know Silas, only saw a man in a faded work shirt and worn-out jeans, a man who looked like he hadn't seen $50 in a year. 100, Sterling said, his tone meant to end the matter. 150, Silas said, his voice a little stronger now. He hadn't moved. His gaze was fixed on the ring, not on Sterling, not on the crowd, but on the small hand knotted in the mule's mane. A low murmur started. This was no longer about business. This was something else. Sterling's jaw tightened. This was about pride now. 200. The silence that followed was different. It was tense, expectant. Silas stood unmoving for a long moment. The crowd watched him, saw the slight clench of his jaw. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. He didn't open it. He just held it in his hand, as if weighing its contents against the world. Then he looked up at Jebediah, his eyes clear for the first time in a decade. 300, Silas said. His voice was steady. Final. Sterling stared at him, a cold fury building behind his polished facade. He saw the empty defiance of a broken man. It wasn't worth the trouble. He gave a sharp, contemptuous laugh. "He's all yours, old man." Enjoy your purchase. He turned and walked away, his polished boots leaving sharp prints in the deep dust. Jebediah banged his gavel, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. Sold. To Silas. Silas walked toward the ring, his steps measured and slow. He ignored the stares, the whispers. He went to the auctioneer's booth and counted out the money, every last bill from his wallet. Then he stepped into the pen. The mule didn't lift her head. The boy flinched, but didn't move away from her side. Silas didn't speak to them. He simply stood there for a moment, the sun hot on his neck. Then, in a gesture so quiet and unexpected it silenced the remaining murmurs, he shrugged off his own jacket. It was a simple, canvas work coat, faded by the sun and softened by years of labor. He folded it once, slowly, and then laid it gently over the mule's bony, shivering back, covering the sharp ridges of her spine. It was an act of profound, inexplicable tenderness. He took the frayed rope halter. "Come on," he said, his voice low, not to the boy, but to the mule. He gave a slight tug, and after a moment of hesitation, she took a halting step. And the boy, his hand still in her mane, went with her. The three of them walked out of the auction yard, a broken man, a broken animal, and a silent child, leaving behind a crowd of stunned and suddenly humbled onlookers. The walk back to Silas's ranch was a slow pilgrimage through the heat. The 2 miles of dirt road stretched before them, empty and quiet. Silas held the rope loosely, letting the mule set her own painful pace. The boy stayed glued to her other side, a silent shadow. The silence between the three of them wasn't empty. It was heavy with things unsaid, with histories unknown and futures uncertain. Silas's ranch was a reflection of the man who lived there. The fences sagged. The paint on the small house had long since peeled away to silvered, weathered wood. The barn, once the heart of a thriving operation, stood quiet, its big doors slightly ajar like a mouth in a silent gasp. A decade of grief had settled over the place like a fine layer of dust, choking the life out of it. He led them into that barn. The air inside was cooler, thick with the scent of old hay and forgotten leather. He guided the mule into a clean, empty stall bedded with fresh straw he'd laid down years ago and never used. He unclipped the rope and filled a bucket with water from the hand pump, the rhythmic squeak and groan of the handle the only sound. The mule drank, long and slow, her whole body seeming to sigh with the effort. The boy watched, never letting go of her. Silas left them, returning a few minutes later with a bowl of stew and a piece of bread. He set it on a crate near the stall. "For the boy," he said to the barn walls. He didn't look at the child, didn't want to spook him. He retreated to the far side of the barn and began to methodically clean a piece of tack, his hands moving with an old, familiar grace. Hours passed. The sun slanted low through the barn's dusty windows, painting long golden stripes across the floor. The boy hadn't touched the food. He had finally sat down in the straw, his back resting against the mule's warm, solid flank as she lay in the hay. At one point, the boy began to stroke the mule's neck, a repetitive, soothing motion, a soft scrape of his small fingernails against her hide. From across the barn, the sound made Silas freeze. His hands stilled on the leather strap he was oiling. That sound, that rhythm, a memory, sharp and brutal, pierced the fog of his mind. His daughter, Elara, when she was just a girl, sitting in this very barn with her first pony. She had a way of scratching its neck, just so, a sound he had forgotten he remembered, a sound that now echoed in the cavernous silence of his heart. He closed his eyes, his breath catching in his throat. It was just a coincidence. It had to be. Later, as dusk settled, a truck rumbled up the drive. It was Marion, who ran the town's general store. She was a widow herself, a woman with kind eyes that saw more than most. She carried a basket covered with a checkered cloth. She found Silas standing in the barn doorway, staring out at the fading light. "Saw you at the auction, Silas," she said softly. He nodded, not turning. "Was there. You bought a mule." "Came with the boy," he replied, his voice flat. Marion looked past him into the dim stall. She saw the child, small and curled against the animal. "A boy needs more than hay, Silas. And a roof over his head that isn't a barn." She set the basket on a workbench. It was filled with sandwiches, a flask of milk, and 2 apples. "The sheriff was asking about them." "About you?" "Let him ask." Marion hesitated, her gaze full of a gentle concern he had deflected for years. "That man, Sterling. He has a reputation. You should be careful." She didn't say more. She knew Silas couldn't bear the weight of direct sympathy. She touched his arm briefly, a fleeting connection, and then left. An hour later, another vehicle arrived. Sheriff Vance. He was a man whose age showed in his slow movements, but not in his sharp, observant eyes. He'd known Silas for 30 years. He'd been the one to deliver the news about Alara. "Silas," Vance said, leaning against the doorframe of the barn. "Got a call from Sterling. Says you absconded with his property. I paid Jebediah. Fair and square," Silas said, his back still to the sheriff. "He's not talking about the mule." Vance paused, letting the words hang in the air. "The boy. He says the boy is his stepson. Ran away a few days ago. Says he has the paperwork to prove it." Silas finally turned, his face a mask of stone in the dim light. "He was selling him." "That's not what he'll tell a judge," Vance said quietly. "I'm just telling you what's coming, Silas. Sterling isn't the kind of man to let things go." The sheriff looked past him, at the boy who was now, finally, asleep. "The boy, what's his name?" Silas was quiet for a long time. "Don't know. He doesn't talk." The sheriff nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on the scene. He remembered Alara, a bright, fierce girl who had her father's quiet intensity. He remembered the light going out of Silas's eyes when he was told she had died in a car crash hundreds of miles away, leaving nothing behind but a name on a police report. "Be careful, Silas," Vance repeated Marion's warning, and the words carried the weight of a history they both shared. He left Silas alone in the deepening dark, with the ghost of a memory and a silent, living riddle. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. The boy remained a silent enigma. He ate the food Marion brought by daily, leaving the empty plates on the crate. He helped Silas carry water for the mule. He never spoke, but he watched Silas with an unnerving intensity, his eyes tracking every movement. Silas, in turn, worked around him, creating a fragile bubble of routine. He didn't push. He didn't ask questions. He simply existed alongside the boy and the mule, the three of them a small, silent island in the vast quiet of the ranch. The boy, whose name Silas had learned was Leo from a tag sewn into his tattered trousers, had one possession. It was a small piece of wood, worn smooth and dark by the constant touch of his hand. He clutched it like a talisman, slept with it curled in his palm. Silas noticed it, but didn't remark on it. It was part of the boy's silence, a piece of the mystery he didn't feel he had the right to unravel. One afternoon, while Leo was helping muck out the stall, he tripped. The small piece of wood flew from his grasp and landed in the clean straw near Silas's boot. Leo froze, his face a mask of sheer panic. He stared at the object, then at Silas, his eyes wide with fear. Silas bent down slowly, his movements careful not to startle the boy. He picked up the object. It wasn't just a piece of wood. It was a carving, a crude, simple shape of a bird, its wings half spread. The wood was pine, darkened with age and sweat. Silas turned it over in his palm. His breath caught. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, washed over him. He looked from the carving to the boy's terrified face, and then he stood up and walked out of the barn, his movements stiff, automatic. He went into the house, into the room that had been Alara's. It was just as she had left it, preserved in a thick layer of dust and memory. He went to her small wooden dresser, his hands trembling as he pulled open the top drawer. Inside, beneath a stack of faded ribbons and dried flowers, was a small, velvet-lined box. He opened it. There, nestled on the faded fabric, was a matching bird. It was more finely carved, the work of a man's patient hands, not a child's copy. He had made it for her on her 10th birthday. He remembered the feel of the knife in his hand, the smell of the pine shavings. He had made two that day, one for her, and one he had kept, a silly superstition. He had given her the better one. He sank onto the edge of her bed, the dust motes dancing in the shaft of sunlight from the window. He held the two birds in his palm, the old one and the new one. They were a match set, a secret language between a father and a daughter. The scratching sound in the barn, the way the boy looked at him. It wasn't a coincidence. The truth hit him not like a lightning strike, but like a slow, crushing avalanche. This boy, Leo, he was Alara's. He was his grandson. And if the boy was here, then where was Alara? The official story, the one that had broken him, had been a lie. Or not the whole story. The grief he had carefully buried for 10 years erupted, not as sorrow, but as a cold, sharp-edged rage. Someone had lied. Someone had taken his daughter, and now they had come back for his grandson. Just as this devastating realization settled into his bones, he heard it. The sound of an expensive engine, a sound that didn't belong on his long-neglected road. He looked out the window. A clean black truck, the same one from the auction, was pulling up in front of the house, spitting gravel. Richard Sterling stepped out, his posture radiating an unearned authority. He wasn't here for a mule. He was here to reclaim his property. He was here to bury the past. Sterling walked to the front porch as if he owned it, a sheaf of papers in his hand. Silas met him at the door, blocking the entrance. He didn't speak. He was a wall of silent, simmering fury. "I'm not here to argue, old man," Sterling said, his voice clipped and devoid of warmth. He held up the papers. "This is a court order. It grants me immediate custody of my stepson, Leo Sterling. He is a ward of the state, and I am his legal guardian. He ran away. You are harboring a fugitive minor." Silas's eyes flickered down to the papers, then back to Sterling's face. The man's clean, composed features seemed like a mask pulled over something rotten. The name, Leo Sterling, felt like a brand, a claim of ownership that violated something sacred. "He's not your son," Silas said, his voice low and dangerous. Sterling let out a short, humorless laugh. "His mother married me. That makes him my responsibility. A responsibility I take very seriously." He took a step forward, trying to peer past Silas into the house. "Now, are you going to give him to me? Or do I have to have the sheriff arrest you for kidnapping?" As if on cue, Sheriff Vance's patrol car rumbled up the drive, followed closely by Marion's truck. They had seen Sterling's vehicle head out of town. They got out and walked toward the porch, their expressions grim. The allies were gathering. Vance looked at the papers Sterling held out. He read them slowly, his face unreadable. "This looks official, Sterling. Signed by a judge over in your county." "It is," Sterling said, his confidence swelling. "Now, Vance, I want you to enforce it. Go in there and get my boy." The sheriff looked from the paper to Silas's stony face, and then toward the barn, where Leo had hidden himself away. Vance knew the law, but he also knew the truth had a shape that didn't always fit on a piece of paper. "Silas isn't a kidnapper," Vance said, his voice even. "The boy was abandoned at the auction." "A misunderstanding," Sterling snapped. "One that's about to be corrected. Now get him." Marion stepped forward, her presence a surprising force. "You leave them alone, Mr. Sterling. That boy is terrified of you. Anyone with eyes can see that." Sterling turned his cold gaze on her. "This is a family matter. It doesn't concern you." He turned back to the sheriff. "Vance, do your job." Silas hadn't moved. He held the small wooden bird in his pocket, its sharp edges digging into his palm. He was no longer just a broken man hiding from the world. He was a grandfather. He was a protector. He looked at Sterling, and for the first time, saw not a wealthy bully, but the man who had been near his daughter at the end. The man who held the answers. "He stays," Silas said, the words an unbreakable vow. The standoff had begun. The confrontation moved to the barn, the air thick with the smell of an approaching storm. Dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, mirroring the tension that crackled between the small group of people. Sterling had called in deputies from his own county, two large, impassive men who stood behind him like granite bookends. They were here to enforce his will. Inside, Leo was huddled in the stall with the mule, his small body trembling. The mule, Daisy, lay in the hay, her breathing shallow, but her eyes were open and fixed on the boy. She seemed to sense his fear. "This is your last chance, Silas," Sterling said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Give me the boy. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." He took a step forward, his polished boots crunching in the scattered hay. Silas moved to block the stall, placing his body between Sterling and his grandson. Marion and Sheriff Vance stood just behind him, a small, defiant line. "You're not taking him," Silas said, his voice resonating with a strength no one had heard from him in years. Sterling's facade of civility finally cracked. A sneer twisted his lips. "You think you can stop me? You're nothing. A washed-up old man living in the past. Hilara told me all about you. How you drove her away with your silence, your suffocating grief. She wanted nothing to do with you. The words were like a physical blow, but Silas didn't flinch. He saw the lie in Sterling's eyes. He saw the desperate need to control the narrative. What did you do to her? Silas asked, the question cutting through Sterling's tirade. She had an accident, Sterling spat. She was reckless. Always was. He lunged forward, pushing past Silas to grab for the boy's arm. Leo, come here now. Leo cried out, a small, choked sound. And then, something extraordinary happened. The mule, Daisy, who had been lying so still, so close to death, struggled. With a deep, groaning effort that seemed to take every last ounce of her strength, she pushed herself up. Her legs trembled violently, but she got to her feet. As Sterling reached for the boy, she moved her body, clumsy and weak, but deliberate, placing herself squarely between the man and the child. She lowered her head and let out a rattling, defiant bray that was more air than sound, but it was a clear and powerful act of protection. Everyone froze. The deputies, Sterling, Silas, they all stared at the dying animal that had summoned the will to make one final stand. In that stunned silence, the boy, Leo, who had not uttered a single word, looked at Sterling's furious face. Then he looked at Silas, his eyes pleading, and he spoke. His voice was a tiny, hoarse whisper, but it carried across the barn. He hurt Mama, Leo said. He pointed a trembling finger at Sterling. He pushed her. The words hung in the air, a devastating, simple truth. Sterling's face went white. At that exact moment, Sheriff Vance's radio crackled to life on his hip. He lifted it to his ear, listening. His eyes, fixed on Sterling, hardened into chips of flint. That was my dispatcher, Vance said, his voice cold and heavy with authority. Marion made some calls earlier. To the hospital near where Alara died. A nurse finally called back. She remembered Alara. Remembered how scared she was of her new husband. Alara filed a report with hospital security a week before she died. She even tried to amend her will. She left everything, including guardianship of her son, to her father. If he could be found, Vance took a step forward. She described a carving he once made for her. A small wooden bird. The final truth landed, shattering Sterling's power completely. His bluster, his legal papers, his authority, it all evaporated into the dusty air. He was exposed, not by a lawyer or a judge, but by a child's memory, a dying mule's love, and a nurse's conscience. The fall of Richard Sterling was not dramatic. There was no struggle, no shouted denial. The fight simply drained out of him, leaving a hollow, pathetic shell. When Sheriff Vance nodded to his own local deputy, who stepped forward with handcuffs, Sterling offered his wrists without protest. The deputies he had brought from his own county looked away, their faces etched with a deep and sudden shame. They turned and walked back to their vehicle, leaving him to his fate. As Sterling was led away, the first fat drops of rain began to fall, spattering against the barn's tin roof. The storm had finally broken. The wind died down, and the world outside the barn doors seemed to sigh in relief, the rain washing the dust from the air. The quiet aftermath was profound. Marion walked over and put a gentle hand on Leo's head, her touch full of a warmth that promised safety. The mule, her duty done, sank back down into the hay, her breathing still labored but somehow peaceful. Silas stood there, looking at the boy, his grandson. He saw Alara's eyes staring back at him, not with fear anymore, but with a dawning, fragile trust. The dam of grief and guilt that Silas had built inside himself for 10 long years finally crumbled. It wasn't a violent collapse. There were no sobs, no shouts to the heavens. It was a quiet, internal surrender. A shudder ran through his entire body, a deep, seismic release of a pain he had carried for so long it had become a part of him. He felt the weight of a decade lift, leaving him feeling raw and exposed, but lighter. He knelt slowly in the straw, his knees cracking. He didn't reach for the boy. He just knelt there, his gaze holding his grandson's, letting the silent understanding pass between them. After a long moment, Leo took a hesitant step forward. He reached out a small, dirt-smudged hand and placed it on Silas's shoulder. It was a simple, tentative gesture of comfort, of connection. In that quiet touch, a broken man began to feel the first stirrings of healing. The passing of seasons began to mend the land and the people on it. The harsh heat of late summer gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. The rain had washed the world clean. On Silas's ranch, the change was visible. Fences were mended, their new posts standing straight and proud against the skyline. The flaking paint on the house had been scraped away, and a fresh coat of white primer covered the old, weathered wood. A small vegetable garden, neatly tended, grew near the back porch, a patch of stubborn green against the browning landscape. Inside the barn, Daisy the mule rested in her stall. She was still old, still frail, but the desperate exhaustion was gone from her eyes. Her coat had a bit of a sheen, and she ate the mash Silas prepared for her with a slow, steady appetite. She had become the quiet, beloved queen of the small kingdom. Silas had found a new purpose. It was not a grand, dramatic transformation, but a quiet reawakening. His days now had a rhythm dictated not by the ghosts of the past, but by the needs of the present. He was teaching Leo, not with long lectures, but with shared work, with the language of hands. He showed him how to mend a leather strap, how to listen to the breathing of an animal to know its health, how to feel the heft of a tool until it became an extension of the arm. Leo, in turn, was slowly emerging from his shell of silence. He still didn't speak much, but his quiet was no longer born of fear. It was a thoughtful, observant quiet. Sometimes he would ask a question, his small voice clear in the still air. Why does the leather need oil? Is Daisy happy? And Silas would answer, his own voice losing its rust, becoming smoother with use. They had formed a new, unconventional family. Marian was a constant, warm presence, often arriving with a fresh-baked pie or a pot of stew, her visits filling the small house with the scent of cinnamon and the sound of gentle laughter. Sheriff Vance would stop by sometimes, not on official business, but just to sit on the porch and share a cup of coffee, watching the man he thought he'd lost to grief slowly returning to the world of the living. One late afternoon, with the sun casting long shadows across the pasture, Silas and Leo stood by the fence, watching Daisy graze. The light turned the valley gold, the same way it had for 100 years. Silas pointed toward the distant hills. "You see how the light hits that ridge?" he said, his voice soft. "Your grandmother, she loved this time of day. Said it was when the world told the truth." Leo didn't answer. He just leaned his small body against his grandfather's side, his gaze following Silas's gesture. He slipped his hand into Silas's, his small fingers wrapping around one of the man's calloused ones. They stood there together, a man and a boy, watching the day end, not with the sorrow of a final goodbye, but with the quiet, certain promise of a new dawn.